A trip to the mall was usually the highlight of the weekend. The mall had everything from our favorite stores to the food court, movie theaters, and arcade. It was always buzzing with people, the halls filled with the happy sounds of shopping. So let's take a look back at all the stores that made the mall so special, because they are now gone forever. Florsheim Shoes started in 1892 in Chicago, Illinois, and they quickly gained a reputation for style and workmanship. Florsheim began opening locations across the country, and eventually settled in just about every shopping mall that opened up. The lineup of shoes grew to include women's shoes, and by the 1980s, they even carried athletic shoes. The chain was successful and survived into the 1990s, but as many shoe stores from that time, they have since disappeared from malls. Although the shoe brand can still be found in other retail stores, the days of stopping by a Florsheim store in the mall are over. During the 1980s, the Esprit logo was everywhere. The staple mall store began as a clothing line sold out of a VW bus in San Francisco and grew to become a mainstay in malls across the country. But the bold and modern stylings of Esprit didn't match up with the changing fashion trends of the 1990s. It was actually a combination of marketing, pricing, and perception issues that led to the downturn. Esprit ultimately closed all of its North American stores following a huge earnings slump in 2011. Today, the company is a shadow of its former self and operates mainly in Europe and Asia. If your mall didn't have a Sam Goody or a Suncoast Motion Picture Company, it probably had a Musicland. Started in Minneapolis in 1955, Musicland grew to be a regional chain of music stores, but in 1978 it was merged with Sam Goody, and many of the stores began converting over. However, some of the stores remained Musicland up until the late 1990s. At that point, Sam Goody became the flagship brand. But the downfall came when Best Buy purchased the Musicland Group, which owned Sam Goody, and they began to hemorrhage money. With the rise of downloading and streaming music, the Musicland Group really had no chance, and Musicland's sister store, Sam Goody, would eventually become FYE. One of the most memorable mall stores during the 1980s was the Glamour Shot Studio. Moms, young adults, and even teenagers would pay for makeovers and photography sessions that were defined by big hair, white satin gloves, heavy eyeshadow, and contemplative poses. By the mid-1990s, there were 350 locations, but as malls began to falter, so did Glamour Shots. Although the style of photography was pretty iconic, it was also easily dated, which is why locations in malls began to fold. As of today, there is only one mall location remaining, which is in New Jersey. The very first Toys R Us opened in Maryland in 1957. The chain grew and benefited from the birth of popular culture toys like Star Wars action figures, Cabbage Patch Kids, and the explosion of video game systems like Atari and Nintendo. Toys R Us had a stranglehold on the toy market up until the rise of mass retailing and online shopping. Up until 2018, Toys R Us had nearly 750 locations across the country, but the company was strapped with debt and would file for bankruptcy. Over the next 2 years, all locations closed, leaving behind a huge cultural void. The Florida-based Burdines was a staple of the Miami department store scene, and had been since 1898. The Florida store, as it became known, was decorated with palm trees and pastel colors, and locations opened up all over the state. By the 1950s, it was purchased by Federated Department Stores, which would eventually own Macy's as well. Burdine's expansion continued into shopping malls through the 1990s. But the decision was made to rebrand the stores to Macy's in 2004. For 1 year, the store was named Burdine's Macy's, but then the Burdine's name was dropped altogether. The Limited 2 was created by its parent store, The Limited, in 1987. They targeted infants, toddlers, and young girls, and they sold many products that were similar to their adult-oriented brand. The store grew from just 2 stores into nearly 300 by the 1990s. Eventually, products shifted to focus exclusively on preteens, and by 2008, there were over 600 stores. That same year, all Limited 2 locations were rebranded as Justice, which they had launched a few years earlier. The women's clothing retailer Dress Barn began in Stamford, Connecticut in 1962. The store catered to women entering the workforce with dresses and other clothing for the office. Locations in malls began to open across the country, and they would eventually grow to be a chain of 650 stores. As with many mall stores, the heyday was the 1980s and 1990s. But sales slumped, and the chain began to struggle as they entered the 2000s. The parent company, Ascena Retail Group, made the decision to restructure their business, and Dress Barn retail locations were less profitable. So it was announced that all locations would close in 2019. Founded in 1973, County Seat, which was a denim-focused clothing store, expanded in the 1980s to reach nearly 500 stores, with most of them located inside your favorite mall. The store was the go-to place for Levi's, but they would eventually file for bankruptcy in 1996. The popular 1990s store Wet Seal tried to buy the struggling County Seat out of bankruptcy, but the deal was rejected. That's when stores began to close, and another bankruptcy followed in 1999, which ultimately put the company out of business. Brookstone began as a $500 investment in 1965. Initially, it was just a catalog company that offered unique products and tools, which advertised in Popular Mechanics magazine. Soon after, stores began to open, and by the 1980s, they were owned by Quaker Oats. Mall stores were their bread and butter, and eventually kiosks began to pop up in malls too. Focus shifted away from tools and into tech products as the years passed, and by the late 1990s, Brookstone had 150 stores in 32 states, more than 100 kiosks, and an online operation. As the company entered the new century, sales were slipping and debt was increasing. Bankruptcy occurred in 2014, and a second followed in 2018, which led to all of the mall locations being closed down. Rediscover your past by digitizing your family's memories with Legacy Box. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about preserving your legacy, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection. The Sharper Image operated in many shopping malls from 1977 up until its closing in 2008. This place was a playland of massage chairs, remote control contraptions, and odd products that seemed to cost a fortune. Sharper Image expanded to have 187 stores in 38 states, but a problem with their Ionic Breeze air purifier would lead to customers suing them, and that's when the company started to falter. From there, the stock price fell, bankruptcy ensued, and the stores closed up by 2008. Samuel Lerner founded Lerner Shops in 1918. As malls began to pop up in the suburbs of America, Lerner Shops grew to 796 locations. By 1985, The Limited purchased the chain, and in 1992, their name changed to Lerner New York. By the mid-1990s, it was once again renamed, this time to New York & Company, a store that can still be found in malls today. Tom McCann first opened in New York City in 1922, and it became one of the most well-known shoe brands in the country. The Melville Corporation bought McCann in 1952, and the locations grew to over 1,000 by the 1960s. During the early 1990s, however, stores began to close, and by 1996, all retail locations were gone, leaving malls with one less shoe store. The brand itself is still sold at Kmart and Sears, if you are lucky enough to still have one of those stores close by. Aladdin's Castle was the most well-known chain of arcades and shopping malls, and they began in the early 1970s. The locations grew from just 20 in 1974 to over 200 by 1980. With games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong, the arcade was where all the kids wanted to be. By the end of the 1980s, there were 360 Aladdin's Castles, but as home consoles gained popularity, the mall arcade began to decline. Aladdin's Castle was bought out by the video game maker Namco, and most of the locations closed by the end of the 1990s. Merry-Go-Round operated women's clothing stores and shopping malls from the 1970s through the 1990s. It started out as one lone boutique shop in Atlanta and grew to 1,500 stores nationwide that catered to the fashion trends of teen girls and young women. But it would turn out to be too much too fast. Just following the acquisition of men's retailer Chess King in 1993, everything imploded. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1994, and months later they closed all of their locations, making it one of the largest retail bankruptcies in history. Sears was the anchor store at many shopping malls across the country, and it was hard to imagine that ever changing. With over 3,500 locations at its peak, Sears was the biggest and most successful retail company of the 20th century, with mall locations being a huge part of their business. As competition from big box stores intensified, shopping malls began to decline, and so did Sears. Over the course of 3 decades, Sears has slowly disappeared from the shopping mall experience altogether. The popular music store Sam Goody got its start in New York City in the 1940s. In the early days, they would serve nearly 4,000 customers per day, and they became known for giving customers who spent a certain amount a free turntable. As they opened in malls across the country, their employees would offer a wide knowledge of music and were very helpful. They eventually merged with Musicland in 1978 and were later sold to Best Buy in 2000, before remaining stores were converted over to FYE. The Limited was founded in 1963 by Les Wexner, and they offered specialty women's clothing in an era that saw them grow quickly. As the Limited saw success, they came up with other store ideas like Express and Structure, and they also bought out stores like Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, and Lerner, New York. They had over 750 locations across the country before younger fashion stores like Old Navy, Forever 21, and H&M took over. Overnight, it seemed, the Limited was closing stores and laying off staff, and by 2017, all retail locations were gone. KB Toys was founded by the Kaufman brothers in 1922. Originally, it was a candy shop located in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, but during the 1940s, they acquired a wholesale toy company, and they began to introduce toys to their lineup. In 1973, KB became the toy retailer we remember, when they ditched candy altogether and opened shopping mall locations across the country. This was the heyday of toy stores, and KB thrived. But by the 1990s, stores began to close, and bankruptcy was looming. Following a bankruptcy filing in 2008, and all the stores closed, they sold the name to Toys R Us. Filene's started in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1880s. The department store became a familiar sight in shopping malls in the Northeast, and they even spun off a sister store called Filene's Basement. Between both stores, they had around 75 locations. As with most department stores today, Filene's was acquired by Macy's in 2005, and most of the stores were converted over. Wicks and Sticks, which specialized in candles, was started in 1968. They had more than 300 locations by 1988, with many being franchised mall locations. The store began to offer new products, like Christmas ornaments and collectibles, but sales were starting to slip. In 2006, they filed for bankruptcy, and the remaining locations would all close up by 2016. Walden Books opened in 1933 as the Walden Book Company. The first standalone bookstore opened in Pittsburgh in 1962. The bookstore chain was purchased by Kmart in 1984, and they grew to over 1,200 stores, with many of them located in shopping malls. In 1994, Walden Books was merged with Borders, and by 2004, Borders started shedding the Walden Books brand. By 2011, the chain was completely gone. At Recollection Road, I believe preserving the past is incredibly important, and our friends at Legacy Box do too. So much so, they've offered my viewers a code for 55% off. In today's digital age, analog media like VHS tapes and film reels are fading, risking the loss of cherished memories due to things like mold, dust, and time. But Legacy Box, trusted by over 1.5 million families, offers a simple and safe solution to protect your memories before it's too late. With Legacy Box, you can convert your analog treasures into digital memories effortlessly. Send your VHS tapes, camcorder tapes, and pictures to Legacy Box, and like magic, receive back your originals and digital copies for easy enjoyment, sharing, and organization. And here's the kicker. For a limited time, enjoy an exclusive 55% discount at legacybox.com/recollection. Don't let your memories fade. Preserve your past today with Legacy Box. Buy today to take advantage of this exclusive offer and send them in whenever you're ready. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to save 55% while supplies last. During the 1960s, it was discovered that the game chess was trending with young men, so a couple of salespeople from the Tom McCann shoe store opened the first Chess King clothing store in 1968. The chain was popular into the 1980s for all things fashion and would end up having over 500 locations nationwide. In 1993, retailer Merry-Go-Round purchased Chess King, and they would subsequently go on to file bankruptcy, which forced Chess King to close all of their stores in 1995. Hickory Farms started in 1951 and grew to become a staple in malls across the country. The meat and cheese retailer would go on to open over 1,000 locations, which included both physical stores and kiosks. By 2000, the company shifted away from mall locations and focused primarily on their catalog business. Occasionally, Hickory Farms kiosks still pop up in malls, but they are becoming increasingly harder to find, especially as malls themselves close up. Casual Corner opened in 1950 and peaked with 525 stores by the year 2000. The company not only operated Casual Corner, but they also ran stores called Petite Sophisticate and August Max. Initially, Casual Corner sold women's sportswear, but in the 1990s they retooled their lineup and began offering clothing for working women too. By 2005, the chain was facing stiff competition, and they were struggling to make a profit. So by the end of the year, all of the remaining stores were closed. Wilson's Leather started out in Beverly Hills as Wilson's House of Suede in 1950. During the 1970s, the chain began producing products overseas, which saved them money and allowed for expansion into shopping malls. It wasn't until 1986 that the name was changed to Wilson's Leather, and the company would continue to grow until it peaked at over 750 locations in 2002. From here it was downhill. Over the course of the next decade, many of the locations closed. They instead refocused on an online shopping experience, with the remaining retail locations closing up too. The t-shirt chain Gadzooks was founded in 1983 in Texas. The store was a teenage hotspot, and their retail lineup catered to young people. To take up floor space in the early years, Gadzooks used VW Bugs as displays, and it would eventually become a trademark at most of their locations. There were nearly 200 stores by the mid-1990s. In 2003, the chain decided to drop their underperforming boys' clothing line in an effort to boost girls' sales, but the gamble didn't pay off. In 2004, they filed for bankruptcy, and eventually Forever 21 would buy the company and phase out the remaining stores. The Kinney Shoe Company opened in 1894 and was the largest family shoe retailer by 1936. Woolworths bought the company in 1963 and would go on to create a new division of Kinney called Foot Locker. Kinney remained a big name in the shoe business through the 1990s. That was, of course, until their parent company began closing hundreds of stores. In 1998, the last remaining Kinney shoes was closed, but the brand still lives on in their sister store, Foot Locker. JCPenney was once a fixture of many downtown areas, but as shopping malls grew in popularity, JCPenney shifted to anchoring many of these malls. This giant of retail started in 1902 and would grow to over 2,000 stores by the time it peaked in 1973. The 1980s and 1990s were spent selling off divisions and closing underperforming stores. Trying to figure out where they fit in the world of big box stores and online shopping has been difficult, and a 2020 bankruptcy would end up leading to fewer and fewer locations. Today, it's hard to even find a mall with a JCPenney. Fashion Bug, which was started in 1940, was a specialty and plus-size clothing retailer that would grow to 1,200 stores nationwide. The stores catered to middle and lower class pocketbooks and would become the foundation of a larger company called Charming Shops, which would also own Lane Bryant and Catherine's Plus. In 2012, Charming Shops announced that all Fashion Bug stores would be closing, with the final store closing its doors in February of 2013. B. Dalton Booksellers started in 1966 by Bruce Dayton of Dayton's department store out of Minneapolis. He named it after himself with one letter changed, and he liked the way it just sounded dependable. Stores peaked at nearly 800 locations, but they were struggling to compete with discount booksellers. So by 1986, B. Dalton sold to Barnes & Noble. The chain continued to shrink, and by 2010, Barnes & Noble closed the last remaining B. Dalton stores. Circus World was originally founded in 1964 as Child's World. The toy store would be sold and renamed Circus World in 1970 and would grow to 330 locations. The drugstore Rite Aid owned the company during the 1980s, and by 1990, they were bought up by KB Toys. Most of the Circus World locations were converted over, but a few of them carried the name up until 1996. Wet Seal got its start in California in the 1960s, but took the name Wet Seal in 1990, after the owner described a model wearing a bathing suit as looking like a wet seal. The mall store was a hit during the 1990s, and they looked for other concepts to help them expand. A new store called Arden B was the result, so together with Wet Seal, the chain grew to over 500 locations. In 2013, Wet Seal was in direct competition with Forever 21, and they were losing. By 2015, they filed for bankruptcy and closed over 300 locations. Officially, the last retail location stayed open until 2017. That's when the business moved to be strictly an online store. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and make sure to check the description of this video for links to pick up a t-shirt and sign up for the newsletter. Thank you to our loyal Patreon supporters listed here. Visit patreon.com/recollectionroad to join the club. As always, thank you so much for watching.